Have you guys seen that cartoon where there's this one person standing in front of a huge crowd and they're saying, yes, all of you are wrong? Well, on early Genesis with the Christ-centered model that I teach, that is kind of me. I mean, I will stand my ground on that one and say to anyone who has a view that conflicts with that of early Genesis, yes, and that's basically almost everybody, yes, all of you are wrong. On this one, though, this is Exodus. And this is when did the Exodus happen? About when did the Exodus happen? I'm holding on to my conclusions very loosely on this one. I'm putting this out there for consideration because there are people I respect that have a different opinion on this. And so I'm not saying with the same certainty that I'm saying with early Genesis that what I'm suggesting is correct. But this is what I think is correct. And I've sort of been drug into the issue because I will present the Christ-centered model for early Genesis, and I will say, look, so now this is no longer an objection to early Genesis being history because the narrative is different. And now if you change the narrative and make it Christ-centered, then this other objection also goes away. And you do this 2 or 3 times and they'll say, yeah, but still the Exodus never happened. So it's still not really history. And so I've looked at it, and I've looked at the traditional dates given and the traditional dates examined, and the 1277 BC, the place name Ramesses existed, but some other things don't. And Israel was definitely in the land by then. You can definitely tell that the inhabitants of Israel were distinctively Israeli. Not true maybe a couple of centuries earlier. But then you also have the traditional date. The traditional date, which is by the people who, that's not 1277 BC, the people that take 1 Kings 6 at its word. 1 Kings 6 verse 1 says that there were 480 years, or this is what they think it says. Well, I'll say what they think it says, and then let's look at what it really says. That there were 480 years from the Exodus to the start of Solomon constructing the temple. And we know pretty well that he started constructing the temple about 967 BC. And so they subtract maybe 967, 968, 966, somewhere in there. So they think, well, the Exodus was in about 1466 BC because they just do the math and they take it at his word. Those who hold to the earlier date say, no, it's a symbolic number. It was 12 perfect generations or something like that, which I've never found convincing. Okay. But there is something I have found convincing that allows us to look at dates in different ranges. And when we do, we find something pretty remarkable. There is a strong case to be made that the Exodus is a historical event. Now, let's start, though, with 1 Kings chapter 6, because that is the verse of Scripture that has been constraining roughly half. I know there's a lot of unbelieving scholars that just say, nope, there was no Exodus, it never happened. They always say that. It's because they're unbelieving. I think in this video you're going to see there's plenty of evidence, and I'm hardly scratching the surface. So let's look at 1 Kings 6, chapter 1, or chapter 6, rather, verse 1, in detail. 1 Kings chapter 6, to me, has an anachronistic numbering system, one that seems to only be found in Genesis and in one place in Exodus, chapter 12, 40, and 41, which sort of harkens back to the events and to the days of Genesis, almost as if even in Exodus, they were looking in their records, trying to count the years from the start to where they are now, and they notice in their records, wow, these years are written in a little different format. We're going to use the same format here in Exodus 12, which is from the olden days. And it isn't used elsewhere. There's not too many examples you can point to. Maybe when it lists the age of the life of Moses or the age of the life of Joshua, but they don't use it there. It doesn't seem to be used anywhere else except 1 Kings 6 and Genesis, and this one place in Exodus where they reach back to the days of Genesis. So this tells me three things, one of which I want to focus on the next slide. But one, it is a sign that the Genesis material is more ancient even than the rest of the material in the Torah, almost like the tablet theory. Like Moses compiled early Genesis, the early part of Genesis, out of tablets that were ancient even in his day. That's the tablet theory. And to me, this is a data point. These anachronistic numbering system found only in Genesis and then this one place in Exodus. And then it's not found anywhere else except in 1 Kings 6. And so to me, that's a sign that Genesis is more ancient material. They used more concise numbering systems after that. And it tells me something else, too, that the scholars don't seem to be aware of, or is contrary to the view of most scholars. And that is, when 1 Kings was written, they knew about this pattern in the Torah. They knew that these very ancient numbers and their foundational documents had a weird, anachronistic number pattern, and they chose to use it, dust it off and use it to make their own historical statement in 1 Kings chapter 6. That doesn't happen unless you have a complete Torah, unless you have a complete set of records and you notice the pattern, because you have the whole set. You don't just have scraps and paper that someone later assembles into a document. So the third thing, which I want to focus on the next slide, that I think it points to, is that they needed a number from ancient history, and maybe they didn't have the exact number. Just like we look at Judges today, and there's so many overlaps, and there's so many events listed that took time, but they don't give the number of years of that time. They couldn't come up with a literal number either, not an exact number, but they could come up with a right number. They could come up with a correct number that meant what they were trying to say. And that is going to be my next point on 1 Kings chapter 6. The numbering system is unusual, and I think that means something. Now, these aids on the screen I got from BibleHub.com. It's a great resource. And the word part there is some commentary on the word translated 80 in this verse. And then I've got a snippet of 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, from the interlinear translator part. And I put the arrows pointing to the word year. Now, I'm going to read this just as it's written, which is not how it's translated, as far as I can tell, in any translation, except for Smith's literal translation. Smith's literal translation of the Bible translated this verse according to what is there in the Hebrew. Everybody else, I think, including a couple that claim to be literal translations, put what they thought it must say instead of what it says. Here's what it says. And it came to pass in the 80 year and 400 year after had come the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Did you catch that? It's got like the word year twice, and it's got it almost as if you're really looking at it literally, it's saying they came out in the 80th year and the 400th year, which is an impossibility, and people dismiss that as an impossibility, and so they translate it 480. But if you go look in how the numbers are translated elsewhere, like in 2 Kings, when it says 185,000 Assyrians were killed, then the number is listed as you would expect, 185,000 killed. So it doesn't break it up and, say 85,000 a number and 100,000 a number. It doesn't do it. This is the only place, as far as I can tell, this is the place where that happens, that awkward phraseology, which could be interpreted to mean, if you're looking at what it says, this unusual grammar is saying it happened in the 80th year and the 400th year. Now, this is normally dismissed, and I'm not one for, in most cases, dismissing the numbers in the text and saying, no, it's not a literal number. I'm not for that usually. If it says, unless it's in Revelation or something, if it's giving a number, it's probably talking about that number. However, in this case, the numbers they use and the fact that they phrase the grammar so strangely, I think compels a fair-minded person to take another look. Is there something about the number 80, and is there something about the number 400 that would make them use these, and instead of a literal number of years, they would use this as the number between the Exodus and the start of the temple? Yes, there is. Look at what it says in Strong's Concordance about that number, or translated 80, the number 80. It says it's derived from the Hebrew root meaning to be fat or to be robust, which is usually associated with the idea of an abundance or a fullness. And the Hebrew word is used to denote the number 80, but it appears in various contexts throughout the Old Testament. Genealogies, records, descriptions, but it can also symbolize strength, maturity, completeness, reflecting the fullness of life or of a significant period. In other words, your typical full lifespan is 80 years, so it's come to be used as fullness or completeness. Hey, it's time. The course has been completed. And that fits fantastically with what is going on here. For the first time, there was the Exodus, and Israel was in the land as a bunch of loosely confederated tribes, and then they finally got a king, and then that didn't work out, and they got another king who was not his son. But for the first time now, with Solomon, Israel had a king, and he passed his kingdom on to his son, and that son has initiated the construction of the temple of the Lord, and the Lord is the basis of their nation. And so they, in the fullness and completeness of time, when it was supposed to happen, the temple is started. This long process of leaving Egypt and all the struggles they've had, and trying to take possession of the land and fighting off enemies. And now finally, not only do they have their own nation, there's been the relatively peaceful transfer of power from father to son, but now they are starting to build that temple to the Lord that David, his father, had wanted to build. And it goes on. It says, in ancient Hebrew culture, numbers often held symbolic significance. The number 80, being a multiple of 8, carries connotations of new beginnings and renewal, as the number 8 itself is associated with these themes. In the context of age, reaching 80 was considered a sign of a full and blessed life. So, I think it's pretty obvious there that what they were saying is that this is a number of completeness. We've made it as a nation. We've arrived, or a new beginning too, because we've finished our journey, and now we have a new beginning as a nation with our own kingship that has passed from father to son, and the temple to our God, to the God. And not only that, but the year 400, or the number 400 and 400 years, has obvious connotations as well, because they spent 400 years captivity, or 400 years as aliens and strangers, and God told Abraham back in the beginning, understand that for 400 years, your descendants are going to be downtrodden and possessed, and they're not going to immediately take possession of the land, but they're going to after that, is the implication. And what they're saying here in this verse is, time's up. Our time of being without a land and being without a real country is over. We've got it now. We have our own state and we have our own church. And back then, church and state were intertwined. And to be a complete nation, they weren't even considered a nation by other nations back in the period of Judges, because they had no king. That's probably part of why they wanted a king. That's a different lesson, but the point is that states had their own religions, and now Israel is complete. They've got their church and they've got their state. And I know that doesn't make sense to those of us who believe church and state should be separated and have seen the problems when they're not. But that makes perfect sense in that context. And so we're not talking about a literal 480 years from the time the temple was constructed to the Exodus, because that's not even what it says. It says it happened in the 80th year and in the 400th year, both together, because it happened at a time of renewal. It happened at a time of completeness. It happened when their long struggle to become a nation and to possess the land is finally over. And that's what that meant. And with that said, it's fair even for a person who has a high view of Scripture, like I do, to not be bound to 1446 BC. And besides the fact the Septuagint says 1440 BC, but of course the number 40 has significance too. But even the Septuagint is not as perplexing as the Masoretic text is on this verse, but it does, once you know to look for this, it does leave it a little more open. It says the 40th year and 400th. It doesn't say year twice, but it does have that sort of grammatical quirk about the way it lists the time. So with that said, let's move on. So one of the big problems with 1446 and really 1277 in that area too, is that if you read and take seriously the scope of devastation in the Exodus and how Egypt was brought to her knees by those events, it doesn't fit with what we know of Egypt around the times of 1446 BC and even later. So something doesn't add up. And we go back in past, and what do we find? Well, one thing that I think everybody's overlooking in this is that there wasn't always one Egypt. There were two Egypts. Really, at some points, there were a number of small states of Egypt, but there were two main Egypts. And this is reflected in the crown of the pharaohs, one of the crowns. They had several crowns, but what they call Upper Egypt, which is south on our maps, which is closer to Nubia, it's down further, but it's Upper Egypt because the river, it's upstream. They had a white crown for their kingdom. And then up in the delta, where the children of Israel are, which is called Lower Egypt, it's north on the maps, but it's Lower Egypt because the water flowed into it that way from the higher ground south. And so they had the red crown of that pharaoh. And there were two different lands that were united. Classical Egypt, the two were united in one crown. And so were there two Egypts at different times in the past? And the answer is yes, there were. The red crown and the white crown were united, as you see there on the screen, when Egypt was together. But many times there were two different Egypts, an upper and a lower. And that's one of the times I want to talk about. There was a period when Egypt was divided, and it was very humbling for the south or the main Egyptians. And this is the Hyksos period. And it was from 1600, 1700 BC up until maybe 108, 109 years. There was a period of time where they had invited in so many foreigners, largely Semitic foreigners like the children of Israel. They had invited them in to settle Lower Egypt, which is the delta in the north, and they grew strong and they grew powerful, and they actually overthrew their masters or their hosts, and they took over the country for a while. They completely took over Lower Egypt, which is the part in the delta, which is the part where the children of Israel lived, which is the Red Crown area. And they sort of exerted hegemony over Upper Egypt, or the southern portion, the area under the White Crown, so that it had broken into, at one point, a number of vassal states that paid tribute to the Hyksos, who were Semites, but they had adopted Egyptian ways and customs and dress and names. And so it was a deeply humiliating period for Egypt when they had to suffer under the hand of these foreigners they brought in. And so it is very natural when you go back and read Exodus, and we read, hey, along came a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, and he persecuted the children of Israel. It is very natural to assume that this is once the native Egyptians kicked out the Hyksos, that those were the guys friendly to Joseph, and that the people hostile to Joseph were the original Egyptians who finally overthrew their former guests who had toppled them for a while. And it's very understandable to think of that, and that they were the ones who were mean to the children of Israel. And that's kind of the main argument that those who argue for a 1446 BC Exodus claim. They claim that the Hyksos were the ones that welcomed Joseph, and then when the regular Egyptians under Amos the first finally expelled the Hyksos, then they were mean to the Israelis and children of Israel, and sometime later then in 1446 BC there was an Exodus. Now, I don't think that's the case. If you go back and look at the account, there's a language barrier between the sons of Jacob and the Egyptians at the start of this account. And there had to be a translator, and Joseph was pretending like he couldn't understand them when they talked among themselves. So that wouldn't be the case with the Hyksos. They were also a West Semitic language person. It would be like Portuguese and Spanish. You could catch it. It would be not that much difference in the language. The difference in the language goes away when Moses and Aaron are confronting Pharaoh later on, at the end, just before the Exodus occurs, at the end of the persecution. And so what I'm saying to you is, it makes more sense that Joseph originally rose to power under the regular Egyptians, and he was sort of a favorite of the regular Egyptians, and his people were sort of a favorite of the regular Egyptians, but they were situated in this area that had been settled by Semites who eventually rebelled against the Egyptians and took over. They came in as guests, but they took over the country. And you can imagine something like that happening today. You invite, and it's happened throughout history, you invite too many foreigners into your nation, and they wind up running the place. And if one group of that foreigners is sort of favored by the native population, then the other foreigners resent them. And I'm saying that's what happened. That's really what happened. That Joseph came right before the Hyksos took over. And when the Hyksos took over, they were the ones that did not know Joseph. But they knew that the children of Israel were connected to the guys they had just kicked out. They were connected to the southern Egyptians, to the white-crowned Egyptians. And so they said, you know what? We got to keep these people down. We don't want happening to us the same thing that we did to the Egyptians. They're going to get numerous, and they're going to overthrow us. Isn't that the way it is with people who are acting unforthrightly? They're always worried someone else is going to do to them what they did to others. And so I think that kind of explains what happened and moves the timeline back. And if you move the timeline back, guess what happens? It makes sense. The Exodus makes sense. There's evidence for the Exodus and the things described in the plagues in Egyptian history. Of course, we don't have all the records. The Egyptians, especially the Egyptian government, lied a lot. They took credit for things they didn't do. They made things up. They didn't mention it when things didn't go their way. But that was the regular Egyptians. What I'm saying is, we've been looking for this period when Egypt was brought to its knees, and we haven't really found it. And I'm saying it was there all along. If the Egyptians we're talking about are the Hyksos, if the Egyptians we're talking about are the northern Semitic branch that took over, if those are the ones that enslaved the children of Israel, if they enslaved their Semitic kinfolk, because their Semitic kinfolk were too tight with the Egyptians that they just, to the south, that they just overcame, then it makes sense. And that Egypt was brought to its knees. History tells us what happened to that Egypt. And not in complete detail, because it was a very long time ago, but basically the southern Egyptians had tried to overcome them for a long time. And under Sennacherib Tao, I believe was his name, he had tried to overcome and erase the humiliation of these invited guests, or these guests coming in and taking over the place. He tried to reconquer the north. And as near as we can tell, his body was mutilated and in bad shape. As near as we can tell, he lost a battle and may have been even ceremonially executed by the Semites in the north. Well, a few years later, his son goes up, Chamos, and notice that this is the time period when the Egyptian names have Mos in them, different things that sound like Moses. So it even fits with the names. That's not the case in 1277 BC. The common names have changed since then, but it works out fine if you're in this period. So Chamos took over, and after a few years, something happened. A few years after he took over the throne, even though his father got killed by the Semites, he went against them, and he had one victory after another. And the only reason he turned back was he caught a courier from them to the Nubian king, to the south of him. And what it sounded like was the northern Egyptians were trying to plot with the Nubians to come against him in the south and get him on a second front. While he's with his army up in the north, they're going to attack, the Nubians are going to attack him from the south. And so he hustled back down south. And at that point, I believe he died, and he didn't get a chance to finish the job. And his brother was just a kid who didn't come of age for a while. But guess what? As soon as his brother came of age, guess what happened? He jumped up there and he started wiping out the Hyksos. And it didn't take very long either. He went from one victory after another. In other words, this is a nation. In a previous generation, they had the power to take Egypt. Now they didn't have the power to keep it. And he ran them out. He conquered their capital. Some historians who reported centuries after the fact said, well, he made a deal with them, and they left and they founded Jerusalem. And I think that this is sort of conflating the children of Israel with the expulsion of the Hyksos. And the expulsion of the Hyksos wasn't really much of an expulsion. With the children of Israel, it was an expulsion. It even says in Exodus, the Lord says to Moses, he's going to expel you from the land. Right now, he's not letting you leave. By the time I'm done with him, he's going to kick you out. And so, even after he took the capital, Amos the first, he then went after any Hyksos settlements that were sort of east of there in Canaan. And he started attacking them too. He wanted to wipe them out. And he may have done so. He may have wiped them out because they kind of disappear from history. So I think what we got here is a situation where the southern Egyptians, the main Egyptians, they don't want to say this. They want to give credit to their kings. They want to give the glory to their kings in the battle. But what really happened was Egypt was weakened by all these plagues. They were weakened by their workforce, their slave force leaving, and then their army changing their mind and pursuing them, and that army getting wiped out. And that weakened them for a generation. And that was the last generation because they had made enemies. And their enemies came and finished them off. And that nation no longer exists. You know, we're looking for the Egypt that was brought to his knees. That is the Egypt that was brought to its knees and eliminated. There were still some Semites living in the north, but they were really kept down at that point. They were not allowed near power again. So if you go back to this time period, and this would be in the 1500s BC, when you're looking when the Exodus might happen, maybe 1530s, somewhere in there. If you look, there's quite a bit of archaeological evidence that weird supernatural disasters happened to Egypt at that time. As a matter of fact, there's this, and I remember seeing parts of it. I don't know that I've ever seen the whole thing. Exodus Decoded, James Cameron directs it, well-known director. And it's making the case that there were several natural disasters there that could have been the impetus for the things recorded in Exodus. I don't even think it's from the position of a believer, but it's just saying, wait a minute, we see these records coming to us from history, and they're saying some really weird things happened at this time that sound like they could have set up the plagues in the Exodus. Let's take a look at a little bit of that evidence. Each of these would probably rate a video on its own, and there are videos you can look up about them and accounts. The Tempest steel from 1500 BC, so this isn't about the time period that we're talking, that there was meteorological phenomenon and the sky being blacked out and things similar to what some of the plagues described in Exodus were going on. They were prominent enough for the southern Egyptians, the ones that were not perhaps the direct recipients of this blow. The Hyksos in the north, that was the Egypt that was catching it. These guys were sort of their reluctant vassals, resentful vassals who used to be in charge. And so, but they're noticing, they're making this stele commemorating these weird phenomenon occurring. And that wasn't about the right time, but this was from down in Thebes, looking up at Avaris, looking up at Memphis in the north. So that was from a long way away. But then we have the Ipuwer papyrus, and this is, I think it's written in the 1200 BC or so, but it was from a much earlier document, and they don't know exactly how much earlier. But there are striking similarities between what Ipuwer says is happening and the Exodus account. And I would urge you to go look that up. Go look up the Ipuwer papyrus or the admonitions of Ipuwer and be amazed at the similarities. Now, one thing that was a little different is that he's complaining about the Asiatics. He's complaining about them coming, not necessarily them going. But if you are a native Egyptian stuck in the north part of Egypt, where you're no longer in charge, the Semites are running things, you are complaining about them coming, even if you're in the midst of all these plagues where one group of them runs off. You're still upset that they've taken over your society, and there used to be Egyptians everywhere, and now there's all these foreigners everywhere, and there's civil disorder and civil disturbances, and there's hail and plagues, and the river is red with blood. Yeah, he says that. The river is blood. He says that. So, again, it's very striking. It's very striking. But it's not something that happens in 1446 BC. The manuscript is more recent than that, but it's referring to something that happened more along in the 1500s BC. And so the evidence is there. Things like this happened in Egyptian history. Now, there are attempts to find natural explanations for these plagues. That's what that video I showed you in the previous slide, that's what it was trying to do. But nevertheless, they happened. They just didn't happen in 1446. They didn't happen in 1277 BC, but they happened. What about ideas that make us think the Exodus could not have happened in the 1500s BC, say 1530 or sometime around there? Well, one is the idea that there was Egyptian hegemony over the area that was Israel during, let's say, 1450 BC, like from the period of Amos the First all the way through into the 1270s. So that you would have to believe the children of Israel, they were in the land, but at the same time, Egypt was in charge of the land. And that can't be. Either it's their land or it's Egypt's land. And I think if you see a lot of maps, like I've got this map here I found online, it's very typical of the maps that show the empire of the day, and it shows that Egypt not only had Egypt, but it had the Levant all the way, including maybe not the 2.5 tribes that were on the east side of the Jordan River, but all the rest of them has it as Egyptian territory. And so I checked that out because I wanted to make sure what I thought was the case, and that is you can't really look at that map and say this is an area that Egypt garrisoned and exercised direct political control over. When it says it's under Egyptian control in that day, what it meant was once in a while, maybe one time during his reign or 2 times during the reign of every pharaoh, or maybe not, they would go take a tour through that land with their army and go collect tribute from the cities. And they would pretend like, yeah, that's your land. We give you honor, and here's some gifts, O Pharaoh, which he would call tribute. But he had an army with him, and they'd swear oaths of loyalty to him. And then as soon as they were gone, those oaths would be forgotten. And a lot of times, the real targets of the fight of these pharaohs is the Hittites or the Mitanni Empire that's to the north, and they were just traveling through. So they would go through with their army, and they would find nobody that wanted to fight them, and so they'd say, well, that's our land. And instead it's just like, oh, the Egyptians are on their way to fight the Hittites or the Mitannis again, and so we're going to let them, and we're not going to get involved because they're just passing through. So he took his army through the land. There was no one to challenge him, so in his mind it was his. They bragged that it was theirs. But the day-to-day lives of the people on the ground, it was not Egyptian land. They didn't really control that land. They had some of the cities, there was a relationship where they were technically vassals, but they would have to, Egypt, once in a decade or so, Egypt would send an army through and remind the kings of those cities, hey, you're a vassal to me. Oh, yeah, your check's in the mail. Here, oh, I got your tribute right here. And then they go away, and that's it. So if you have a people that is not a centralized people, do not have a central capital, do not have a government, it's like it's not even a target for the Egyptians. They don't even count that as a true people, and that's kind of what I said in the beginning. So when they're passing through on their way to fight the Hittites or the Mitanni, or sometimes there would be a pharaoh who never did that in his whole reign. He would fight the Nubians. He would go south and fight. He would go west and fight the Libyans. And he would never at all enter the land of Israel. So it's really, that part, it's really not a conflict at all. The idea that Egypt nominally held control of this land, but on the ground there was someone else. They were living their lives, they were planting crops, and there were still, as we're going to see, there were still some Canaanites there throughout. It's not like Scripture is even claiming when Joshua came in and conquered that he wiped out all the Canaanites. And I went with detail. When I did the research for this, I went in detail for the reign of each pharaoh to see how much time he spent on this strip of ground. And it really wasn't much. Some of them didn't go at all. But the same thing can kind of apply to Joshua when you look at the conquest. Now, if you look at a map of Israel as divided among the 12 tribes, and this is just the kind of map that would be found probably in a Bible you may have in your own home. There's another version of this map that's somewhat smaller. It doesn't show the Philistine territory as being a part of the division of the land. And it doesn't show East Manasseh going all the way up to Mount Hermon. So there's a couple of versions of these maps because the division of the land was not attained maybe until you get to Solomon. It wasn't attained. They didn't conquer all this land. Joshua chapter 13, Joshua chapter 18, and the chapters in between shows the messy reality that a simple map like this that you might find in the back of your Bible doesn't show. Joshua 13 starts off by saying, Now Joshua was old and well along in years, and the Lord said to him, "You're old and well along in years, but very much of the land remains to be possessed." And that was the case. In Ephraim, there's Gezer, I believe. There was never, the Canaanites were never kicked out of it, and that's pretty close at hand. Then there were some other things in there, like 5 of the tribes, or actually 7 of the tribes, didn't receive their full possession. Dan did not receive their full possession, and some of them went north in the actual, when we see what Israel actually looked like, and the lands are, the facts on the ground differ a little bit from this allotment. This was the allotment that they were given at the time. They kind of dismissed, okay, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, East Manasseh, you guys can go back on the other side of the river now. We'll take it from here. But at that time, only 5 of the 7 tribes had gotten their allotment, and they didn't even get the whole allotment if you look at the details. So one thing is, you might think, well, there's a conflict because they're saying they fought at, I don't know, Megiddo, and the Egyptians say they fought there, or Hazor, or a couple of these other sites. Well, let's say the Exodus was in 1530. That means they sojourned until 1490 BC. Meanwhile, Amos the First and the Egyptians were wiping out the rest of the Hyksos, okay? And they were going around stamping them out, and the children of Israel missed that whole thing off in the wilderness. And then they go in and they take possession of the land, but not everything on this map. But this map was the goal, but what actually happened is what is described in Joshua chapters 13 through 18. And it's messy, and there's Canaanites left in several cities, and there's places they didn't get their whole inheritance. So they don't really control all this land on the map, and they wouldn't. King David, when he became king, you can look at a map of his reign. He didn't get it. Not until Solomon did Israel really look as big as what is shown on the map here. So it is not ruled out by the idea that Egypt was operating this area at the same time that during the period of the judges of Israel. The period of the judges of Israel, these people control the ground, some of this ground, but Canaanites control the rest of it. And just because Egypt goes and attacks Megiddo doesn't mean that Joshua can't come and attack later. Like Amos the First might attack Megiddo, and then Joshua can attack Megiddo. It was the same city, but look, Joshua lived to 110. At the end of his life, he hadn't conquered everything yet. So you start at 1490, and let's say that Joshua was 20 years old at the time that he was a spy, and then 40 more years passed, so he's 60, and then from 60 to 110, that's 50 more years. Sometime in those 50 years, he fought some of these cities that, a couple of them, the Egyptians might have had a fight at too. But there's plenty of room for overlap. It doesn't rule out the idea that one was attacked by one and then the other was attacked by the other. So there's no conflict there. In addition, like Jericho, this brings Jericho, the complaint for those who say the Exodus never happened. They say, well, this Jericho was destroyed, but it was destroyed earlier than the Exodus date you people are giving me. Yes, it was destroyed around 1500 BC. So pretty much the same time as I'm talking about if you push these events back further into the 1500s BC. So it's not an obstacle. The fact that the children of Israel were operating the land during this period of Egyptian hegemony, once you understand what's really happening, how little day-to-day control the Egyptians had on the ground, it is really not an obstacle. And it actually makes the destruction layer of Jericho line up really well with the dates of the Exodus, the time range I'm suggesting. Again, you can't pin it down because Judges, the book of Judges, you can never really figure out exactly how long ago or how long the period of the judges took. People try to chop it down to 350, 360 years because that's the amount of time they need to comport with a 1446 BC Exodus date. But we don't have to worry about that anymore. Now, some of these periods of judges, they're overlapping. Like if you just put all the dates suggested in Judges and you line them up, it's almost 600 years. I think Flavius Josephus said the period of time from the Exodus to the start of the temple was 592 years, not 350 or 360. Now, some people say, well, he didn't account for the overlapping periods in Judges. Maybe he did account for the overlapping period of Judges, because there were also some incidents in Judges that were listed that they don't assign a period of years to, but it's clear took a period of some time. So if you want to subtract out the reigns of the judges that overlapped, to do the accounting right, you also need to find the times where an event is mentioned and it's clear that event takes time, but no number of years is assigned to it. So you'd have to add those back in. So if the pluses that you would have to add back in equal the minuses, then that count would still be about right, and it would take us back to the 1530s BC. So the hegemony of Egypt is not a problem. The length of the judges that the judges took is not a problem. What might be a problem? The two things that might be a problem for this idea is, number one, the culture in Palestine does not look specifically Israeli until the 13th century BC. So I'm saying that really the 15th century BC is when they first came and took over the land. They took over the land early, perhaps, in the 15th century BC. It's when the conquest took place. And so, does it look like there were Israelites? Did the land have a population boom? And the experts would say, no, it doesn't. They look very much like Canaanites. And the land does not have a population explosion for a couple of centuries. Now, why do I not think that's a problem? Why do I not think that that's a serious problem? Well, because when they came into the land, they weren't just adding themselves into the land. They were also killing people and running people out of the land. A conquest is not a great time for a population boom. There should be a population fall that takes a long time to recover from. And so I would think that is what we would see. We would see that pioneers have lean kids is a phrase I've heard before, that first generation that goes in and conquers, that first generation that takes over the new land, they adjust, and it takes them a while to put their stamp and their mark on the land. So that if an archaeologist came and said, well, America in the 1800s, that really wasn't the culture we have now because there's no interstates. Well, it just took us a while to put our stamp on the land. The interstates didn't get built until the 1950s when there was a federal gasoline tax put on. And as hard as it is to believe, all those vast interstates you see crisscrossing the United States were just a series of back roads or two-lane state highways before the gas tax was put on in the 1950s. So it's astounding how quick the change was. But by the time you see the change, the culture and the impetus that built up the change took a long time to get there. And I think that's going to be the same case, or take even longer, with a culture that does not have modern technology. And the other thing is, the Israelites and the Canaanites were kindred peoples. See the Christ-centered model for early Genesis on Genesis, but I do think that the line of Messiah and the people that survived the flood, there was lots of people outside of the line of Adam. And there's a lot of people outside the line of Adam that survived the flood even. Go look and see my videos on that if you have any doubt. So the Canaanites and the Israelites were descendants of Noah, and a world where not everybody was. Their culture looked alike, their habits looked alike. In addition, and see my video on how many people there were in the Exodus, the number of people that left with the children of Israel was vast. It was much bigger than the number of people who were actually descendants of Israel. When Pharaoh kicked them out of Egypt, everybody in that group that was tired of being mistreated saw that they were leaving and the Egyptians were giving them plunder, and they said, you know what, we're leaving, we're going with them. We're going to take some of that plunder too. And so Israel has never been an ethnically homogeneous nation from its founding, and DNA tests reflect that. There's no one, for example, there's no one Y haplogroup that's dominant in Israel. Abraham was probably a J2, I think I concluded, but J2 is about 1/7 of Israeli men. So, they were a mixed bag. There was a mixed multitude that went with them, it says in Exodus, and they were a mixed bag from the beginning. So yeah, it should take them a while to develop a distinctly Israelite culture. So that doesn't, to me, that's not disqualifying either. That it takes a couple of hundred years for there to be a population boom, and takes a couple of hundred years for the Israelites to become who they are. Yes, the family of Israel, most of them may have had some good ideas, but they might have also had a lot of bad ideas that are rubbed off from their neighbors and their close kinfolk, the Canaanites, who were probably, some of them were the other Semites with them in the land of Canaan. I don't use Semite the way most fundamentalists would use it, because I think all the sons of Ham, maybe some of the Japhethites split off with other groups early, but at least all the Hamites and all the Shemites, they would all be Semites. They would all share that language and that culture, and they would be close kin to each other, with close culture to each other, because of their common roots, in a world where other people could be much more different. So it's not disqualifying. In my view with my view of Genesis, with a Christ-centered model for Genesis, where it is about preserving the line of Messiah, where Adam is a specially created man to bring the line of Messiah, and there's other people in the world, and that the flood is targeted at the line of Messiah. It's not targeted at the whole world. And please, to those who say that doesn't sound like what the Bible says, I've got either look at my videos, or if you're a real glutton for punishment, buy my book on early Genesis, where I explain it in excruciating detail. But the other factor that says, well, wait a minute, Mark, here's a red flag that you've got this date wrong, and it was much later in time. And that is, it says in Exodus that he got a chariot, okay? Joseph got a chariot from Pharaoh. Not the people that hated him later, which I'm saying is the Hyksos. Okay, but the original Pharaoh, which I'm saying is Egyptians before the Hyksos took over the northern part of Egypt and made the rest of them tributary to them. I'm saying that guy gave Joseph a chariot, and that would have been, 1700 BC or so, maybe a little earlier, and the Egyptians were not known to use chariots until much later. Now the Hyksos did. Some say that the Hyksos came in, swept in, and used their chariots, and that was their advantage in war that helped them to beat the Egyptians. Doubt has been cast on that idea, and they think it now was more process of they just kept moving in until they were dominant. But they had the chariots, they had the tech. That wasn't the key to them winning and kicking out the masters, maybe, or kicking out the previous folks who owned the land, which was the South Egyptians. But it was a part of the mix. So, the thing is, it is not saying, if it had said that there was a big battle with chariots and the Egyptians had chariots and Joseph commanded a bunch of Pharaoh's chariots in battle, I would say, yeah, it's too early for that. So my date would be wrong, because Egypt didn't have that tech on a massive scale at that time. But that's not really what the claim of the text is saying. The text of the saying is that Pharaoh had 2 chariots. one for himself and one he gave Joseph. And so if you are the ruler of Egypt, including the ruler of the north at that time, as this story begins, that has all these Asiatics that have developed the chariot, you can acquire a couple of chariots, not to fit your whole army with, not 100 chariots, but you go there and you see, hey, they're using these chariots. They can get around in a hurry. And this was in the days, by the way, that people didn't ride on horseback. Okay, the use of chariot was, except maybe on the Eurasian steppe, but by and large, people had chariots before they even rode horses. And so the brave man that got up and tamed the first horse. So that's what is going on here. And it may not have even been horses that pull this chariots. It may have been donkeys that pull the chariots. But the point is, it is not disqualifying to what I'm saying that the Pharaoh of Egypt had two chariots at his disposal, one that he kept for his personal use and the other he gave to his right-hand man. You don't have to say that this has been incorporated into military technology or it's widespread. Guess what? The President of the United States has access to tech that we don't have access to. Okay? The President of most big advanced countries, they have access to things and tools and tech that we do not. Maybe in 50 years we'll all have access to it. But right now, they're ahead of us. So it's kind of the same thing. It's kind of the same thing that just because Pharaoh was able to get a hold of a couple of chariots, maybe from his, at that time, subject, Hyksos, in the north, for his personal use, does not mean that the use of chariots was widespread in Egypt. And we don't see the Egyptians for another century or so having a widespread use of chariots. And that's okay, isn't it? That's the way tech always works. The guys on top get to use it first, and pretty soon it gets a little out there a little more, and pretty soon the commoners figure out how to build it cheaper, and more of us get it. So that about wraps it up, folks. Basically, the people that say, well, I don't have to listen to anything about the Bible because the Exodus is a myth and it never happened, you don't know that it never happened. Maybe it never happened in 1446. Maybe it happened BC. Maybe it never happened in 1277 BC. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. There's plenty of evidence that it happened, and there's nothing to disqualify that evidence. And that's my claim right here. Now, someone may want to pick this apart and try to show that it wasn't. I welcome that. It's basically doing science with the scriptures. It's theology. It's the study of God as a science, the study of the Word of God as a science. I want theology to move a little more that way, because if they do, I believe they're going to adopt all of these ideas that I've been talking about, because that's what I did. I applied the scientific method. When I get these ideas, the first thing I do is I say, now wait a minute, Mark, isn't there some historical fact or fact of nature or other scripture that disqualifies what you're saying? And sometimes I find out that there is, and I say, well, okay, I must be off on that idea. But in this case, I don't think there is. Let's start that process. I do appreciate you and thank you for taking the time to listen, and may God bless you.